Dr. Lubchenco, in one sense, needs no introduction. In another sense, I could go on for a long time, so I'll try and make this very brief. She received her PhD at Harvard, and one of her advisors there was actually Tom Shaner, who's on our faculty here. She is currently on leave from Oregon, where she is the Wayne and Gladys Valley Professor of Marine Biology and is now the Director of NOAA and the Undersecretary of Commerce. Among the areas of research that she's made major contributions to are to the study of hypoxia, dead zones in the ocean, population dynamics and ecology of algae, and marine reserves. She has had numerous honors. I'll only mention one or two. She's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences. She served as president of the Ecological Society and as past president of AAAS. And I would like to emphasize one more thing, that Dr. Lubchenco has been very interested and very influential in developing the relationship between science and the public, science and communicating issues to the public, and science that is in the public interest. And in that vein, she was one of the founders of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program, which was a training program to provide communication skills to scientists in mid-career, which has been extraordinarily successful and extraordinarily important. Her talk today, and unfortunately this will be her only talk, is entitled Sustaining the Beauty and the Bounty of Oceans, Grand Challenges for Science and Society. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Jane Lubchenco.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Alan. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. And thanks also to the Storer Lecture Selection Committee. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience and a lot of young faces, both of which are terrific. It's really a treat for me to be back on campus and to be at a place where there is such a hotbed of very exciting, cutting-edge, but relevant science. And I'm deeply, deeply frustrated that I can't be here the entire time and take greater advantage of interacting with all of you and seeing everything that's going on. One of the aspects of my job is you sort of do what your boss tells you, and in my case, I've got two primary bosses. One is the Secretary of Commerce, and the other is the President. And then, of course, we also pay special attention to members of Congress, and so my schedule changes frequently, and you just kind of have to adapt. I want to do a couple of different things in my remarks today. One of which is to give you a sense of some of the dynamism, some of the frustrations, some of the good progress that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. And I want to do that in a way that focuses on NOAA specifically, and oceans more specifically within the context of NOAA. But I want to paint a broader picture for you that gives you a sense of what NOAA is and what we do, sort of how it's a good fit, at least for me, and I think for many of those of you who are in the audience, how it affects the kinds of things you do, and then hone in on the ocean part of our agenda more specifically. Many of you may not know that NOAA has its roots as the oldest scientific agency in the U.S. government. It was founded initially not as NOAA, but as the Survey of the Coast in 1807 by Thomas Jefferson, who was president then. And it was broadly appreciated how important doing navigation and charting was for coastal areas, for commerce, as well as for warfare. And so a scientific agency, the Survey of the Coast, was the nation's first scientific agency. Fast forward a number of decades to 1870, and the National Weather Bureau was established, and then the next year, the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries. Fast forward a couple of centuries to 1970, where under President Nixon, those different pieces, the Coast Survey, the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, the Weather Bureau, and other pieces, many of which had evolved independently, were brought together under a single umbrella with the understanding that was actually pretty revolutionary at the time, that oceans and atmosphere are part of an integrated Earth system. They didn't use the language Earth system that we would use today, but in fact, that was part of the concept that to really do justice to managing oceans, you needed to know something about the atmosphere. To make good predictions about weather, you needed to know something about the oceans. And so this integrated nature was the philosophical basis. In 1970, when NOAA was the NOAA that we know today, it brought together these science-related pieces with a focus on providing services such as weather forecasts, weather warnings, navigation maps, but also providing a stewardship responsibility, managing fisheries, managing protected species, turtles, marine mammals, other protected species. And that integration, in principle, took a long time to actually make realistic, to bring all those pieces together. There were silos. What you hear about a lot of federal agencies was absolutely true of NOAA. In the intervening years, however, there has been very significant integration across those different parts of NOAA. And we saw that deep, deep integration come to fruition during, for example, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or the NOAA's contribution to the response to what the Japanese are calling the 3/11 events, the earthquake, tsunami, and radiation events, where our satellite division, our weather division, our fisheries division, our coastal division, our research division, all came together seamlessly to provide services and stewardship responsibility underpinned by the science. So it has been very exciting and energizing to be at the helm of such a dynamic, science-based services and stewardship agency. And as an academic, all of my professional life, but not completely naive or new to Washington, it actually has been very refreshing and engaging to see not only some of the amazing things that are underway, but also very frustrating to experience many of the challenges that are there now. And I want to spend my time giving you a little bit of sense of some of that dynamic, some of the things that are happening now, and how you play a critical role in all of that, not only for NOAA, but for many of the issues that the nation is struggling with more broadly. I know that many faculty and students and staff sometimes feel, especially when you're way off on the left coast, sort of isolated from what's happening in DC, and yet what you do and what you say and how you connect with the broader world is more important now than it has ever been. So one of the things that was really important to me in coming to NOAA was to reinvigorate the scientific part of what we do, and that's both intramural as well as extramural science. And part of the commitment that President Obama made when he came to the White House was to, in his language, restore science to its rightful place. And within the first couple of months of his administration, he issued an executive order on scientific integrity, and then charged John Holdren, his science advisor and the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the agencies, with fleshing out the general guidelines, general principles that he laid out. NOAA took this charge very seriously, and we embarked upon a very deliberative and inclusive process to come up with a policy on scientific integrity that would work for us, that would respect the integrity of science, that would enable scientists to participate actively as practicing scientists in their professional scientific societies, in talking to the media without having to go through a gatekeeper when talking about their scientific results, in making sure that the results that are discovered would not be suppressed or changed or distorted. And so we now have issued our scientific integrity policy, and I think it is a landmark policy. Not all other agencies have finished theirs. I'm particularly proud of ours and think that it is a model for many others. And part of my goal in choosing the process that we used was very much to have a process that would result in a product that was embraced by the entire agency, as opposed to a top-down, the administrator, the undersecretary says, this is the way it's going to be, in which case it's just going to fly out the window whenever there's the next administrator. And the process was one that was definitely embraced by the scientists and others at NOAA. It applies to everyone at NOAA, not just the scientists, and I think is really remarkable, and I'm very proud of that. So across the many different responsibilities that we have, we've had a lot of successes and a lot of significant challenges. The challenges are looming large as we get into what people in Washington call the silly season, which is the year leading up to the election. And I guess it's silly in some ways. It's also incredibly frustrating in others because it's just, it's crazy. It's crazier than it is silly. But despite that, those challenges, there are some really good things that are happening. Before I move on to oceans, I did want to just note that this last year was a very significant year for the nation. It's one for the record books. And NOAA is the keeper of many of the weather records and climate records. And most of you have undoubtedly heard about the record-breaking weather that we had in 2011. And I just want to make sure that it's on your radar screen because I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to. NOAA tracks lots of different things. One of the things that we track are the number of events, weather-related events, that are so intense that they cause at least $1 billion worth of damage. In a normal year, there would be 3 to 4 such events, each of which totals at least $1 billion. The all-time record was set in 2008 when there were 9 over $1 billion disasters. In 2011, to date, in other words, we haven't finished the tallies, but to date, we have counted 12. We have documented 12 such at least $1 billion weather-related disasters, and we're still crunching the numbers on some others. So I think that that's a wake-up call for the nation. Those events include tornadoes, wildfires, droughts, and floods, and very extreme snow or rain storms. So it's across all the different categories of weather, and it has affected all parts of the country. Some of those events are most likely strongly connected to a changing climate. Others, like tornadoes, we cannot as easily connect the dots because we don't quite understand what the relationship is between these very small-scale, intense events and larger-scale phenomena like climate change. But I think that 2011 is really a wake-up call for the nation and is a harbinger of increased wild weather, increased variability that we are likely to be seeing. And I want to make sure that because that's part of NOAA's portfolio, I want to make sure that was on your radar screen. So I want to segue to the ocean part of NOAA's portfolio, understanding that your interests are broader than just oceans, but I want to just focus on something concrete and something specific to give you a sense of some of the very remarkable progress that is being made, but also some of the very distinct challenges that we have that are out there, and then use that to come back to some of the larger issues that underpin those challenges. So let's talk about the other 99%. Now, you may have one idea of what that means, but I want you to be aware of the fact that the oceans represent 99% of the biosphere. And so as we are thinking about framing how we talk about things, the other 99% is pretty much sight unseen, out of sight, out of mind, and not really on many people's radar screens to the extent that it needs to be. It's a very distinct and important part of NOAA's mission, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that responsibility is both a coastal one and an oceanic one. So what's happening in oceans, what's not happening, what's needed? And my message in this is going to be pretty much the following, that this is really a critical time for oceans. Scientific information tells us that oceans are changing. They're changing radically and rapidly. And those changes have direct and indirect consequences to people, to our economic systems, to our lives, to our health, to our well-being. The rates of change are unprecedented. The scales of change are unprecedented. And in some cases, the types of changes are unprecedented. And in particular, those changes are happening faster than we can document them, faster than we can understand them, and faster than we can respond to them. If we wait for signals, then in fact we're always playing catch up. And this in fact is one of our collective biggest challenges. We're making very impressive progress in dealing with a lot of the issues, but the progress is incremental. It's incremental in documenting the changes, in understanding the changes, and in dealing with the changes. There are very real practical solutions that exist to many of the challenges, but they're not being adopted. They're not adopted at the scale that we need, either the spatial or the temporal scale. And so, in view of the importance of oceans to our health, to our prosperity, to our well-being, I think it is time for us to fundamentally rethink our approaches to these issues. Approaches to public understanding, approaches to research and monitoring, approaches to policy and management. And obviously, I think that these approaches need to be informed by not just natural sciences, but social sciences, because in the end, most of the changes that we are seeing are driven by choices that people make, choices individuals make, choices that institutions make. I don't know what these approaches look like, but I think we have to wrestle with some of these real challenging problems and think about them in some new and creative ways. And I invite you to help think about what those different ways of communicating, of anticipating, of documenting might be like. I think the good progress that is being made provides hope. I think the magnitude of the challenges provides urgency. And your role is to provide the passion and the creativity. In short, your role is to help us occupy the future, with apologies. But I would say that time is running out, and that now is the time for engagement, for harnessing social networks in ways that we haven't really done to date for issues like this, for adopting and adapting new technology, for connecting the dots in new and creative ways. I think it's really time to redirect the global trajectory and to transition to more sustainable uses. And oceans and coasts are not the only systems for which new approaches are needed. but it's one that I want to focus on. So let me build a little bit of context for some of what I've been talking about and give you some examples of where I think things are going well, where I think we have some significant challenges. So many of you look to Washington, D.C. for funding, for leadership. And so let me start with D.C., with the D.C. perspective. My office at NOAA is in the Department of Commerce. Up on the 5th floor, I can look out one window and see the White House. I can look out another window and see the ellipse, the Washington Monument, the mall that leads down to the Capitol. And that distance from the White House to the Capitol is not that far a physical distance. But I can tell you there's not a lot of common ground in terms of finding solutions to many of the challenging issues that our society faces. I know that that's not a surprise to you, but it's something that I live each and every day. The philosophical distance between the leadership in the White House, and especially that in the House of Representatives, I think could easily be measured in light years. And from where I sit, that makes the kinds of things that I'm talking about even more challenging. Nonetheless, I think we are and can continue to do some very important and very useful things while also laying the groundwork for some of the new approaches that I believe are going to be needed. In some cases, science, which underpins everything we do at NOAA, science, in my view, is not and should not be partisan, but it has been made to be partisan for a number of issues, such as climate change. And that's highly unfortunate. It is a disservice, I believe, to the nation. But in fact, many of the exchanges about climate change are not rational. They are mostly theater, political theater, hearings that I've had. And that is a real challenge. However, in the midst, as I mentioned, of sort of Alice in Wonderland hearings that sort of epitomize the dysfunctional nature of some of Washington, there's very real, substantive, and meaningful progress that we're making on many fronts. And insofar as our elected representatives reflect attitudes and knowledge of the American people, I believe that the way forward will require focusing a lot of attention, as much as possible, on having the American people have a better understanding of what the issues are, what's at stake, what they can do, how they will benefit. And that's particularly true for things like oceans and coasts, where there is woefully little understanding of what's happening. We must work quickly and diligently to turn around attitudes and impressions about oceans and coasts. The common perception that is woefully out of date, but still very real, is that oceans are endlessly bountiful and endlessly resilient. You know, people just cannot imagine how this little activity here or that little activity here could have any impact on something that is as immense as oceans. And even though, you know, it hasn't been that long, a number of decades, since scientists realized that's not true, but the common perception is definitely still out there. We have been making some very remarkable progress on multiple fronts, and we need to continue in that vein. And I want to give you a quick look at sort of where we are now and how we got here. I think it's safe to say that in many ways science is driving new solutions, and there are a plethora of alternative approaches that are out there. Many communities and stakeholders are becoming more engaged, and creativity is really enhancing a lot of progress. We're seeing a lot of that at the local scale, and in some states at the statewide scale in terms of ocean practices and policies. But it has yet to scale up. But I want to reflect on the progress that we've made in some regards as it relates to increasing awareness of the vulnerability, the value, and in oceans, and also the opportunities for alternate pathways. And I want to start with the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy and the Pew Oceans Commission, two independent commissions that got going in the late 1990s, came to fruition in 2003 for the Pew Oceans Commission, 2004 for the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy. Both of those commissions had parallel voyages of discovery, where the commissioners met with and learned from a variety of stakeholders, community groups, scientists, leaders, and citizens about problems, causes, and possible solutions. Both commissions concluded that a hidden crisis was well underway. They both recognized that, contrary to public perceptions and policy frameworks, that oceans were neither infinitely bountiful nor infinitely resilient, that they are fragile and vulnerable to human impacts, and they're often characterized by tipping points. Both commissions concluded that there were very real changes that could be made, and they made a series of recommendations about what those would look like. One of the commissions identified the causes as falling into two major bins: a failure of understanding on the one hand, and a failure of governance on the other hand. And I would suggest that we are actually making quite remarkable progress in both of these, but as I hinted earlier on, that progress is not fast enough or at the scale that we need. The failure of understanding, I think, is both a personal and collective. Individuals become aware, they share knowledge, pool ideas and resources until a critical mass is reached to trigger collective action. And like biological and physical systems, social systems are highly nonlinear. We need look no farther for tipping points than to see two examples such as smoking or drunk driving or many of the events that happened in the Middle East or the fall of the Soviet Union or civil rights. And so I think the question is, what is it going to take to get us to some of these tipping points in terms of public awareness and understanding of the vulnerability, the value of oceans and coasts? In many cases, the individuals, each individual sort of has his or her own pathway to discovery of new things. And I'm sure that many of you have your own experiences in terms of realizing that things were not the way you thought they were. In my case, I started off as a scientist. I loved the excitement of discovery, of solving problems, of understanding how things worked. And along the way, I became more and more aware that the systems that I were studying were changing before my eyes in some cases. And many other, especially field ecologists, have had similar experiences and have seen systems change and become motivated to share what they know more broadly. For me, that has translated into becoming increasingly public and talking about things and founding the Leopold Leadership Program that Alan mentioned, Compass, the Communication Partnership for Science in the Sea, Climate Central, three organizations that I co-founded to help share information that is scientifically based, and now coming to NOAA to help be part of the system, not just providing information to advise, but actually having an opportunity to be engaged directly, not just propose solutions, but actually implement them. But the failure of understanding, I think, so people who, like many of you, have seen systems change, have one experience. The members of the Pew Oceans Commission and the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy had other experiences where they learned together and shared information and came to a very different conclusion from where they started in terms of understanding the scope of the problem. And part of, I think, the challenge is to replicate those experiences more broadly so that those voyages of discovery and increasing awareness of the issues can be shared much more broadly. I do believe that scientists have a key role to play in doing that. I think there's a key role for scientists to not just discover new knowledge, but I believe they have an obligation to share that knowledge with others, not just through peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature, but to share that information with the public, with policymakers. And one of the biggest challenges in doing so is learning how to, as I call it, become bilingual. We teach students, undergraduates and graduate students, to speak the language of science. I believe we also need to teach one another to be able to speak the language of lay people and talk about scientific findings in ways that are understandable, in ways that are relevant to decisions that people are making, in ways that are credible. And scientific assessments have a key role to play in this, but so too do individual scientists. And this is an area where I think universities have a special responsibility and opportunity to be not just training new scientists, not just training those who are going to make the next discoveries, but training everyone to be cognizant of sort of the knowledge that science has. But communication is a two-way street, and scientists also need to learn to listen to what society is interested in and the questions that they are asking. And so this two-way communication, I think, is incredibly important. Both of the commissions, the Pew Oceans Commission and the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, focused on the U.S. exclusive economic zone. And one of the communication, this raises sort of one of the communication challenges that we have. When most people think of a map of the United States, they tend to think of the land part of the U.S. If you just close your eyes and visualize the U.S., it's the land. We don't see the EEZ shown on this figure here, and yet that is a public trust. We are as responsible for that as we are for what happens on land. And it's not part of sort of the mindset that we have in this nation of who we are and what our footprint is. And nonetheless, both commissions, although saying something about international issues, also alluded to the fact that our primary focus is going to be getting our house in order and figuring out how to tackle our solutions. And the recommendations that they made were very much along those lines. And that, in fact, has led to and teed up some of the very significant changes that have been made possible in the last couple of years. And I want to focus specifically on the National Ocean Policy, which you see here being signed by President Obama. Early on in his administration, he created an interagency ocean policy task force to essentially pick up from where the commissions left off. And it's probably useful context, but probably won't surprise most of you to learn that there are some greater than 140 federal laws and regulations that deal with oceans. There are some 26 different federal agencies or offices that have some influence on oceans. NOAA is not the only federal agency. You know, what the Department of Agriculture does with respect to fertilizer policy has a direct impact on hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. What the Department of Energy does with respect to generation of energy has an impact. EPA, the Corps of Engineers, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you can just go through a litany. All of those agencies have their own specific responsibilities. And until recently, there has not been a mechanism for integrating across those. And more importantly, there has not been any overarching set of marching orders. And what the president did in creating the National Ocean Policy was to say very explicitly that healthy oceans matter, that the nation will have a focus on stewardship because we have a public trust responsibility for managing activities that affect oceans. And if we don't take care of them, then we won't be able to continue to benefit from them. And so there is now in place a National Ocean Council that is set up to integrate activities across the federal family. But equally importantly, the National Ocean Policy lays out an explicit role for different regions around the country, groups of states in the New England, for example, or in the Gulf or on the West Coast, understanding that the federal government is not the only one that has responsibility and opportunity to be being better stewards of oceans and coasts. And the proposal is the creation of regional planning bodies that will provide a bottom-up articulation of the primary goals for managing a large marine ecosystem, for example, the California Current large marine ecosystem off the west coast of the U.S., and that will comport with the general guidance from that is articulated in the National Ocean Policy, but is very much a partnership between the regions and the federal government. So this is this is the nation's first ever ocean policy. It's actually visionary and very exciting. It's quite a remarkable landmark to be celebrating. As exciting as that is, and as hard as many people worked on it, it also, its implementation has been quite slow, in part because of two things. One, vested interests who felt threatened by it have been marshaling more and more forces to say, you know, this is a federal government telling us what to do, which is not the case. And equally importantly, with the downward pressure on budgets for all of the federal agencies, there are insufficient funds to be implementing a lot of what was proposed in the policy. So here's an example for you of some very remarkable progress that was made that actually I think will be seen in hindsight as being very visionary, very bold, and lays the template, lays the groundwork for some very good progress. But implementation of it is going to be a long time. It's going to be a long slog, if you will. So the National Ocean Policy is one example. Another example that I would highlight for you of some very distinct progress that we have been making includes what we've been doing on the fisheries front. Congress required NOAA through the Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization to end overfishing by this year. And by that they meant that we would have in place catch limits for every one of the 528 federally managed fisheries in the U.S. Now, that's been no insignificant feat. We are almost there. We will have them all in place by the beginning of the fishing season next year. And that is due to the very hard work of the fishery management councils, as well as the team at NOAA that has been working very, very diligently and hard on this, and to many of the stakeholders that participate actively in the fishery management council process. So the landmark legislation that was crafted in the in the earlier part of this century is now coming to fruition, but with it has brought a lot of political backlash because there are folks that don't agree with what the new catch limits require. Nonetheless, many of the new fishery management tools that we have adopted, including things like catch shares, are doing a much better job of aligning fishing interests with conservation interests and allowing fishermen more freedom to make decisions about their businesses in ways that have the long term in mind, not just the short term. So we're changing the economics of fishing so that there is benefit in thinking long term, not just short term. We're making very good progress on that front as well, and we see some of that playing out along the West Coast, I think, in some very positive ways. Another fishery success that we're having is on the international front, and we are teaming up with the European Union and with other like-minded countries or entities to really clamp down on pirate fishing, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. This is a major, major problem, especially on the high seas, but also in the exclusive economic zones of many developing nations, for example, in Africa, where pirate fishing runs rampant and is a very significant part of the entire fishing activity. So I mentioned those three examples with fisheries, just to illustrate that, in fact, there are some very good positive progress, good things that are being made, but they come at a price, and many of them are, in fact, contentious and challenging. One of the overarching challenges for all of the federal family, as well as for anyone interested in research, is the budget challenges that we are facing now. You see here the trends in the non-defense R&D by agency that AAAS puts out, and this shows the patterns since 1976. And what we can see here is a number of different things. The research budgets are, since 2004, the federal non-defense R&D funding has been flat. Now, the president has put a high priority on science funding, healthy oceans, including the Gulf Ecosystem Restoration Plan, renewable energy, STEM jobs and education, all are important in this administration. But with the downward pressure on everyone's budgets, we're already seeing in 2012, and we're going to be seeing in 2013, some very significant challenges arise. And I would highlight for you that the discussions around these are not taking place in a rational environment in which we're really talking about real trade-offs. It is a situation that it's hard to actually have rational discussions about. And I want to highlight one example for you that's not an ocean example, but I think will illustrate the point. When I came into NOAA, NOAA was responsible for a weather satellite program that had been created many, many years before that was seriously dysfunctional. Now, weather satellites are incredibly important for the nation, for our ability to provide weather forecasts and disaster warnings. The data that we get from our weather satellites represents 90% of the information that go into our numerical weather models, 90%. So they're obviously pretty important. When we were faced with, so we put together, the administration took on this challenge of fixing this particular satellite program that was dysfunctional, reorganized it, put it back on track, and then under the continuing resolution that we had during 2011, we did not have the funds to fund that program. And so we'd fixed the management, we didn't have the funding that was needed. And the funding for that program was an easy case to make. It should have been an easy case to make because the satellite that was that needed the funding for that provides long-term weather information, so anything past 3 days. It provides the key information for all the major weather disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes. We get that information from those satellites. It provides search and rescue, and it provides all the information that we have for the Arctic. And so any one of those should be an easy case to make. And yet, in the discussion about the continuing resolution, there was never any talk about what the consequences of different numbers for the overall federal budget were. The only focus was, what should that number be? There was no focus on consequences, and so no ability to talk about this program. We made a good case for the importance of this program in the 2012 budget, and it was funded, but because it's expensive and because there was no additional funding available, it came at the expense of our ocean programs and our research programs. And that's the direction that I fear we are headed, with more and more downward pressure on our budgets. And so I just want to give you a sense of some of the challenges that we face and illustrate the importance of individual citizens making known what you believe is important as we talk about these larger issues and as members of Congress are making their decisions. So the federal funding situation, I think, is going to be very challenging, and it's very, very political. And so as we think about taking on new challenges, educating people about oceans, doing justice to oceans and coasts, as well as climate and weather challenges, how can we be creative in showing people how important these programs are and that science matters in making solutions? How can we harness new technologies, et cetera? And so I want to segue now to some of the elements of how we need to move ahead and just highlight this challenge that was laid out in a column of Dan Sarowitz's in the last January 4th issue of Nature, where he's really drawing attention to the science research budgets of agencies like NOAA, like USGS, like other Department of Agriculture, not the NSFs, but the mission agencies. And those budgets that are so important to providing the science that we use in making decisions, that science is done by academics, it's done by labs within the agencies, and I'm seeing a real crunch come for those particular budgets. So to make a case for the importance of that research enterprise, for the solutions that are out there, for thinking differently about some of these challenges, I believe that we need much greater public awareness of many of these issues, and would highlight some things like many of the sustainable fishing celebrity chefs campaigns that have been actually very, very effective in garnering public awareness, public attention, as long as they are scientifically grounded, as examples of the kinds of things that are useful in communicating, and different messengers being the communicators about things that are important. Another example, drawing on work that many of you have done on the science of marine reserves, has been, sometimes there's information that's available and we need to be creative in thinking about new ways of talking about it. And Enrique Sala had one of the 10 articles that was just published in the Harvard Business Review, and the review was called "The List of Audacious Ideas for Solving the World's Problems." And Enrique took a lot of the good basic fundamental science that's been done around the science of marine reserves and is proposing the creation of what, excuse me, what he calls fish banks as a way of telling a story in a different way, talking about the importance of marine reserves in recovering bounty and exporting bounty, recovering depleted fisheries, and what some of the potential for that is and how that is a solution. So those are two quick examples of some of the kinds of ideas that are out there. Again, I believe that harnessing new technologies, social networks, some of the things that Google has been doing with Google Ocean as part of Google Earth are an example of that I would highlight. But I probably am communicating because I'm feeling somewhat schizophrenic. You know, I'm really pleased with the progress we're making. We're doing some really good things. At the same time, it's very, very challenging, and there are even more challenges ahead, not just with the budget, but with politics during an election year. But I believe that the progress that we are making is laying a good foundation, but that we need some new and creative ways to be being even more effective and having much broader base of awareness and support and action in support of more sustainable practices and policies. So let me conclude simply by saying that it's been a great honor to be at the helm of NOAA. I'm pleased to be able to share a little bit of my life and my successes and challenges and frustrations that we're seeing at NOAA with all of you, and hope to engage in an active discussion and ideas about how we can work together to address some of these big challenges that are out there. I really do believe this is a critical time for oceans. I believe that there are viable solutions that exist that haven't been adopted, that we need to get creative in raising awareness about those issues and about the solutions and how they affect people. And I'm open to ideas about what that looks like and how we might do that in some fresh ways. Now is really the time for engagement. And scientists have, I believe, obligations not just to create the new knowledge, but to share it broadly. And sharing it broadly means understanding what we know, what we don't know, and what some of the opportunities are for alternate choices above and beyond what we are currently practicing. I do believe that science in this administration has been rejuvenated. I think the scientists at NOAA are very, very excited and very pleased. They're also very nervous about what's coming down the road in terms of budgets, but I think we will continue to persevere, but we want to join forces with the broader academic community in ways that transcend just the research partnerships that we have and go beyond that in terms of engagement, public awareness, and solutions to many of these problems. So thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to any questions that you might have. Thanks a lot. I don't care.
You touched on the crucial importance of NOAA's data and also on the budget challenges. Science reported last December that Congress had asked NOAA to consider charging for its data. I'd be interested on your thoughts.
Members of Congress who appreciate the importance of science and research and data, and even of things like satellites or research vessels, are increasingly asking, are there other business models out there? And other countries have approached many of those different models by way of charging for data, for example, satellite data or other kinds of data. It is not a model that the administration supports. It's not a model that I support for multiple reasons. Citizens have already paid for this, by virtue of their tax dollars. I believe that there are opportunities to add value and make some things available in different ways, but the basic core information, I think, should be just publicly available. We had this discussion at NOAA well before I was there with respect to weather information. You probably know that there is about $1 billion private weather enterprise that has grown up around the basic core data that NOAA provides on weather. So Weather Channel, AccuWeather are just some of the private enterprise weather entities that are out there. And there was a real tension for a while about what is the role of the government, what's the role of the private sector. And after much tension, they sort of came down on the side that the government has a fundamental responsibility to provide weather forecasts, the basic information for weather forecasts and disaster warnings, but that there should be an opportunity for the private sector to take that basic core information, add value, and then sell it. And so that's in fact what you see today. We used that model to propose something that has gotten derailed for political reasons, and that is the creation of the climate service, like the weather service we were proposing. A little bit of context, NOAA has, by legislation, the responsibility of providing climate services. And we, examples, so we define, in this case, climate refers to anything longer than 14 days. Weather models really are good for maybe up to 10 days, but not beyond. And so 14 days plus is climate, and that then gets into both climate variability as well as climate change. And when we do an outlook at late in the year, November, December, about what the spring flooding is going to look like in the upper Midwest, that's a climate service. If we do an outlook for drought for the Southwest, that's a climate service. So there are a whole series of climate services that we already do. Climate science and climate services are scattered around in a whole bunch of different places in NOAA, and we had proposed to bring those all together into a single line office, a single management structure within NOAA to make them more efficient and effective. It was a proposal that was budget neutral, wouldn't cost any money to do this reorganization, and it would be doing what we're supposed to be doing, but more effectively. And because, so that's and the connection to your question is simply that we believe there is a comparable appetite in the private sector, potential appetite for providing climate services, much like the private weather enterprise system has grown up. And so, so we have private weather enterprise. We think there can be a private climate enterprise as well. But for that to happen, the private sector and people, for whatever purposes, need the basic core information that NOAA houses. So long story short, the proposal was not approved by Congress. because it's got the word climate in it, and we don't, and it just, people go crazy when that happens. So, so we were not able to create the climate service. So we will continue. We will abide by Congress's wishes. We will continue to provide climate services, but not as effectively as we think we could be doing otherwise. Yes?
One of the biggest problems I see facing the world's oceans is equitable water rights. I have a nonprofit, Kima Mesopotamia, working on the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Persian Gulf, and we're seeing real loss of biodiversity from lack of water, salinity, just basic no water coming down from Turkey. And I'm seeing that on the Nile, on the Amazon. Will NOAA or other agencies work internationally with this issue of equitable water rights, particularly in light of climate change, to make sure water's getting to the oceans, basically, and the life that lives there?
We don't really have to look at other countries to see that problem. It exists here as well. Look at the Colorado. But NOAA does not deal with freshwater issues. But we do a lot of international work, both on oceans and coasts, but not so much with flows of freshwaters, except in the United States, where those activities affect protected species for which we have responsibility. So if there are salmon, for example, that are endangered, or sturgeon or other species, then through the Endangered Species Act or other federal legislation, then we work with other federal agencies or state agencies to try to resolve water management issues, but seen in this case through the lens of those protected species, not so much through the lens of the flows more broadly. And the example that you cite is really a major challenge internationally, but also for individual countries. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just wondering, as a scientist and as a practicing marine ecologist, what do you think are the major and top changes that we should be most concerned about in the oceans today? Is it pH changes? Is it loss of biodiversity? What would you say are the major changes that are calling their attention to?
Part of the challenge is that there are multiple changes underway, and they interact with and exacerbate one another. Certainly climate change, but ocean acidification loom large. Habitat loss and loss of biological diversity as a result of that. Introduction of invasive species. Flow of nutrients to coastal waters that creates dead zones, all loom large. And again, they interact with one another. But estuaries, other coastal habitats, the loss of that habitat, which turns out to be so incredibly important for many species, not just in those habitats, but many species use them as nursery habitats. So whether it's estuaries or mangroves or seagrass beds, those habitats are under serious threat because of coastal development. And so, that is one of the real challenges, that it's there's not just one single thing. I neglected to say overfishing and destructive fishing gear, but that also is a very significant one. Others? Yes, Andy.
Actually, following up on that, do you have a favorite one or two things that we have the biggest problem where we don't have enough information to actually do good policy, so actually more study would be really important? And for that matter, following up on sort of your answer to that, the previous question, do you have one or two favorite things that seem like most promising where we can change policy and there's the right combination of feasible and important?
Yep.
So what is your nomination there?
So for the areas where we really need better information, certainly ocean acidification looms large. And that's not just, and this leads to my second one, the impacts of ocean acidification, not just on individual species, but on ecosystems. And so if ocean acidification knocks out all of the pteropods that are critically important for salmon, as food for salmon or for mackerels, what are the ecosystem consequences of that? And so my second one was going to be understanding how changes in some components of an ecosystem result in changes throughout the system, essentially. And one of the real, I think, very practical things that is doable, given our knowledge, but that we don't have yet, are better indicators of a healthy ocean. What 5 things can you measure that would give you a sense of whether a system is doing well or not? And so not even talking about how do we know how close we're getting to a threshold, which is another whole set of problems, but what are the big, everyone would like to know where should we spend money, where should we devote more time or energy, and to have better indicators of ecosystem status, ecosystem health, would be very, very useful. In terms of some of the solutions that are out there, I think this is where social sciences has a really key role to play. Economics, but also behavioral sciences. And some of the solutions that are out there that allow markets to help create incentives and change behavior can be very powerful. And that's the approach that we're taking with catch shares, for example. But you could do the same thing with flow of nutrients to coastal waters. If you, I know this is going to be, people react against cap and trade, but it's essentially the same kinds of concepts. If you could cap the amount of nitrogen flowing down the Mississippi and allow polluters to trade, much like we've seen with successes with sulfur dioxide, for example, that creates a whole different set of incentives. And so much of the federal regulatory mindset is command and control, top down. And we don't always take advantage of things like market mechanisms that allow creativity, allow people to find solutions without prescribing exactly what that solution is. So give them incentives to find the solutions. So those are just a couple of examples. Am I getting the hook here?
Well, maybe one more.
Way back in the back?
Can I ask a question? As a mission-oriented agency, in light of the funding situation in D.C. and Congress, how do you envision NOAA's mission in helping the academic community and providing resources to the academic community to try to help solve some of the issues that you just raised, rather than just having to go to something like NSF?
NOAA, like most of the other mission agencies, or many of them, funds a fair amount of academic research, not anywhere near as much as we should. And that's an area where I think we could and should be doing a lot more. One model that NOAA has used for much of its interaction with the academic community are cooperative institutes. And they're cooperative institutes that are doing cutting-edge climate research or cutting-edge weather research or various ocean kinds of research. I think we need more of those, but also more just extramural grant programs. And part of what I noted earlier was the problems for which we need solutions are really exciting intellectually. They really have, a lot of is the cutting edge, but it's also immediately relevant to policy and management. And very few people are championing that as a concept. There's a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about championing for NSF's budget, for curiosity-driven research, which is incredibly important. But that's not enough. NSF needs to be doing what it's doing, and its budget needs to double, in my view. But there's also a legitimate, valid need for growing the research budgets of the mission agencies, and that would and should directly support a lot of academic research. We've seen that in some areas, the land grant institutions, sea grant, space grant institutions were sort of founded on that concept. But I think we've kind of strayed from it's not applied research, it's relevant research that is also cutting edge science. So it's fundamental but relevant science, and that's where I think we need to make a stronger case, and the academic community needs to be making it as well as the mission agencies.
I'm sure we could go on for hours, and we would all enjoy this, but I think we need to let Dr. Lubchenco get to the next part of her day. So join me in thanking Jane again for a wonderful talk.